Now, somebody who'd love to have their say on the show is Dr. Liam Fox, Tory MP for North Somerset, also a former Defence and International Trade Secretary. Liam, if I may call you that. Yes, we're fairly familiar with each other, aren't we? Now, let's speak to you about the G7 first of all. There's a really interesting piece today in, I think it's The Telegraph, by Michael Fallon, your predecessor at Defence. Or was it your successor? Predecessor?
He was successor.
Successor at Defence.
Yeah.
And he said the EU owes Ukraine an apology, making this point about how Brussels has dragged its feet with the provision of weapons. It's taken 19 months to sign this agreement. Do you agree with that assessment? Could the EU have done more for Zelenskyy and his people?
I would differentiate between the EU as an institution and the countries in the EU. Some countries, Poland and Hungary, for example, have had massive amounts of humanitarian aid because they've had refugees coming across the border. Germany has been quite forward-leaning. None of them as forward-leaning as the United Kingdom. And you have to say that under Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak, the leadership in the world has been quite marked. I was in Washington a couple of weeks ago when a number of politicians on both sides said if it hadn't been for the UK's leadership, we in the United States would not be in the position we are.
But France and Germany have prevaricated a lot. They could have done more sooner. We've only just had this announcement from Biden on these F-16s. I mean, it's all a bit too little too late, isn't it, as the streets of Ukraine have been relentlessly targeted?
Well, you must remember, we also had all the economic activity at the beginning. Yes, I think it's fair to say that on the military side, a number of European countries were too slow to act in this. They all have different considerations, and the world looks very different if you're looking at it from the Polish-Russian border than if it does looking at it from London or Washington. But I think that what has become very clear to European leaders over time is that this is not a small conflagration. This is all about the future of international law. As Rishi Sunak said, Ukraine's security is our security. If we allow Russia to roll over all over Ukraine, then where will they stop? And there was another very interesting thing I thought yesterday at G7, which was when Zelenskyy was talking to what's called the political South, India and other countries. These are countries who themselves say that their history is about throwing off the shackles of colonialism. But what is happening at the moment with Putin is colonialism. He is trying to recolonise Ukraine in the name of Russia.
So he's trying to win over the Indians, he's trying to win over Brazil.
And he's quite right. I think it was a very good point that he was making, that the world needs to waken up to the wider historical context of this conflict. And if Putin was to defeat Ukraine, which is, I think, unthinkable now, that would be effectively the end of international law as we know it.
Just in terms of our own defence spending, is it high enough? Was it a mistake for Cameron and Osborne to have cut it?
Well, you have to remember at that time, the public finances we inherited from Labour. There's been some discussion this morning about what's the Conservative government done, remembering the state of the public finances that we inherited in 2010 from Labour.
Defence spending, I mean, successive defence secretaries have raised concerns that were not adequately defended.
Well, I think that part of that problem is that it takes time to get these big procurement programmes in place, and you need to have some certainty. What most defence secretaries would like is a longer settlement in the budget, not necessarily more money. Of course, all defence secretaries want more money.
Would you support the 3% pledge, Liz Truss's pledge?
Well, I've never been in favour of those percentages, because what happens when your GDP goes down in a recession? Does that justify cutting your budget? What we need to see is some confidence that those numbers will be maintained over time so that you can plan properly in defence and so that our allies know what it is we're doing. Yes, we do need to have more defence spending, but of course, like everything else, to have more defence spending, you've got to have sound public finances.
We talked about that headline about are the Conservatives responsible for anything good over the last 13 years? Probably a bit harsh. On Brexit, though, Nigel Farage, my fellow GB News presenter, has described Brexit as a failure. Has the government failed leavers? You were one. Are you satisfied with the current state of quo on Brexit?
Well, I think people now forget the momentous achievement of getting Brexit.
Yeah, but getting Brexit done is one thing, but it hasn't actually been sort of capitalised on. Some of the post-Brexit opportunities that leavers were promised just simply haven't been delivered. You can understand the frustration. I mean, you ask people on the street, has Brexit been a good thing? And a lot of them are having regrets. Yeah, that's a failure of government, isn't it?
You're talking to somebody who was always a constitutional leaver. For me, Brexit was achieved the minute we left the European Union. In other words, we made our own laws. We weren't subject to higher authorities, which for me was the reason for leaving the European Union. Have we done enough? Well, I chair the Global Britain Commission, which was set up to look at the economic opportunities, not just post-Brexit, but post-pandemic, and what's in the world that we now find ourselves, a much more integrated world. Are we, for example, using our aid budget in ways that can help countries maximise what help we can give them through our service industries, for example? It requires a lot more joining up, I think, of the dots of government.
Are we competitive enough against the likes of France, of Germany, now that we've put corporation tax up?
Well, look at our economic performance. I mean, our trade with Europe.
It's not been great.
Well, if you look at post-Brexit, let's look at that. Post-Brexit, our trade with Europe, our exports to Europe are higher than pre-Brexit. That's not true for the European Union, coming the other way. And we've had to do the post-Brexit period, of course, with 2 years of the pandemic, which really trashed lots of parts of the global economy. Now, coming out of that, there are new opportunities. I'm chairing this week, since you give me the opportunity to mention it, at Olympia for 2 days, something called Innovation Zero, which is, instead of complaining about the costs of decarbonisation, let's get out and sell British technology. Let's show the world what we can do, and let's export that. We can fulfil both our environmental aspirations and make money for the United Kingdom.
Final question to you. We're a little squeezed on time, more squeezed than I wanted to be. With regard to the economics of the situation, are we actually being squeezed by the Bank of England? I mean, we've got this report today about Andrew Bailey being warned about inflation back in 2021, brushing it off and saying this isn't going to be a problem, it'll be solved by September.
I know that this was a conversation I had with the now Prime Minister, then Chancellor, when he was really concerned about inflation. A number of us believed that the central banks, the Bank of England, the European Central Bank and the Federal Reserve in America were continuing to expand money supply too much and for too long post-pandemic, and that was going to create more inflation.
So
and it did
Bank of England been asleep at the wheel here?
Well, when they said it would be a temporary phenomenon, clearly it has not been. And I think that we need to ensure that the Bank of England is paying due attention to the supply of money.
Was Bailey found wanting, if he was warned in 2021? Yes or no?
I think there was a groupthink between those central bankers who didn't seem to believe that money supply and inflation were closely linked. As a Conservative, I do.